My name is Zach Gorstein, and I'm a second-year MBA student here at Duke. And it's really my pleasure to introduce Mr. Brad Kitchens, President and CEO of ScottMadden. With more than 25 years of business and consulting experience, Mr. Kitchens has worked extensively in the energy sector on strategic planning, mergers and acquisitions, operations improvement, business planning, reorganizations, and outsourcing. Mr. Kitchens routinely works with energy organizations' lead executive teams and boards of directors. Prior to ScottMadden, Mr. Kitchens consulted with Deloitte & Touche, specializing in capital markets, and also spent several years in the oil and gas industry. Mr. Kitchens received a BS in mechanical engineering from Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology and his MBA here at Fuqua, where he graduated with top honors and was recognized as a Fuqua Scholar. Please join me in extending a warm Duke welcome to Mr. Brad Kitchens.
Thank you, Zach. Zach, thank you for the warm introduction. Yo, hi, Liz, thank you for the invitation. Good morning. It's really a thrill for me to come back to Fuqua and share some perspectives that ScottMadden has on this exciting industry. I will say the one room that really hadn't changed a lot is this very auditorium. I can remember sitting on your side of the stage many, many times back in 1987 and 1988. So it really is a thrill to be back, and I do appreciate the invitation. I also want to say, one, congratulations for this conference. I can't tell you how impressive it is, one. Two, as a student many years ago, I would have loved to have had the opportunity to spend a couple of days and really explore industries as you're pursuing new careers. I know for myself anyway, I did an internship up in New York with the banking industry because I wanted to get a flavor for banking, a flavor for New York, and it was a wonderful experience, and it taught me that that was not something I wanted to do. But we didn't have the luxury of these sorts of industry events. So again, congratulations to that. I also want to offer up a quick, maybe the most important takeaway. ScottMadden is doing a strategic planning exercise right now. And as a part of that, we're trying to determine what are the exciting areas of opportunity for a consulting firm. And we've determined there are four industries that really present some long-term opportunities next 10 or 20 years. One of those is healthcare, probably no real surprise. One of those is financial services, probably no real surprise. A third is around security, cyber, IT, those sorts of issues. And the fourth is this, it's energy. It's international energy, it's international issues and challenges related to energy, and it is, in our view, one of the most exciting opportunities over the next 10 or 20 years. There will be winners and losers. It is an exciting set of challenges and opportunities, and again, for those of you that are exploring this as a possible career, I would encourage you to give it every consideration. If you'll permit me 1 minute, I'll give you a quick overview of who ScottMadden is, because you may not be familiar with this, and then I'll jump directly into the presentation. And I believe Zach will come down here in about 30 minutes and conduct a quick Q&A. So ScottMadden, for your benefit, if you're not familiar, is a general management consulting firm. We do a number of things, but our core business is consulting to the energy industry, primarily domestically or within North America, but certainly we do some international operations as well. I would say the one thing that distinguishes ScottMadden perhaps from other consulting firms is I characterize us as content consultants. We've been around since 1983, and the consultants that we have a passion, a deep understanding of the issues that we're faced with in this industry. So we bring that understanding, that passion, to our client engagements. And so I'll talk a little bit more about some of the things that we're doing over the next several minutes, but that's who ScottMadden is. I am president of ScottMadden. I have been since 2000. And I probably would say just in 2017 alone, I've probably been in a dozen different board settings talking about strategic issues, and I'll share some of those issues with you this morning. So I'm going to talk about four things and then a so what. The four things, I'll start out very, very globally, very macro, and talk about some global industry trends that I think you as future leaders and participants in the industry will need to deal with. Secondly, I'll talk more domestically about some of the challenges that we see within the power industry in the United States. Thirdly, I'll talk about this trend of going green. No surprise, but I'll share some stats with you that you may find interesting or perhaps surprising. Fourth, I'll talk about bigger is better, and I'll set that up when we get there. And then fifth, I'll talk to you about what energy companies are doing in response to these sorts of issues. So let's go macro first, and you'll bear with me for a few stats. If you talk about new energy demand, and I'm not talking power, and I'm not talking current demand, but new energy demand, incremental demand over the next 10 or 20 years, the two variables that drive it are pretty straightforward. It's population growth and it's economic growth. Economic growth is more powerful than population, but those are the two primary drivers of regional, local, international, new energy demand. So if you take each one of those and talk about it globally, I would challenge that you need to make a distinction between the developed world and the developing world, the emerging economies. And so you can slice and dice that different ways. I appreciate that. The easiest way for me to slice and dice that is to say the developed world is made up of those that are a part of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD countries, 35 of them, out of 196 countries. So that's Mexico, United States, Canada, Iceland, and most of Europe. That's Japan, that's South Korea, that's Israel, that's Turkey, that's Chile, that's Australia, New Zealand. 35 countries make up the developed world. The remaining 161 countries make up, by this definition, the emerging economies in the developing world. So if we use that distinction, let's look at population growth and economic growth. A little history. I find these facts fascinating. Let's talk population first. 1800, there were 1 billion people in this world, on this planet. 1900, 70% more. We now have 1.7 billion. 2000, we jump up to 6 billion, 250% increase. We punched through 7 billion in 2011, and today we have about 7.6 billion people on this planet. Out of that, no real surprise perhaps, 2040 will be a baseline that I'll be using for the next several minutes, talking about forecasts of various things going to 2040. And the expectation around the globe is we'll be something north of 9 billion people in 2040. So out of the 7.6 billion we have today, about 17% or 1.3 billion come from those 35 countries. Well, 35 countries divided by 196 is about 17%, so that feels about right. But when you talk about the incremental growth from 7.6 to 9 point something in the next 21, 22, 23 years, well in excess of 90% of that is expected to come from the developing world. Japan's in decline. Europe is absolutely flat, with some countries up, most countries down. The US is creeping upward about 1% a year. All the growth is happening in Africa, in India, and other parts of the developing world. So if our equation for new energy demand is population growth and economic growth, understand, first of all, most of the population growth is going to take place in the developing world. Let's look at economic, even more powerful. In 1800, you may find this interesting, $175 billion was the global GDP. The global economy was $175 billion. In 1900, it was $1 trillion. Now get this, 2000, it's $40 trillion. And today it's $78 trillion. We've seen that kind of exponential growth in the last 220 years around GDP growth around the world. And of course, if you draw the distinction between the developed and the developing, you can see that even though it only makes up 17% of the population and 18% of the countries, it makes up about 62% of the overall economic power of the world. But the expectation is in 2040, the world economy will be $150 trillion. It will double again between now and 2040 in the next 23 years. And the vast majority of that, again, well in excess of 90% is expected to come from the developing world. The three stripes of that, the first most important one is what they call emerging Asia. That's frankly China and India. They've been running at about 7.5%, 8%, 9% over the last 15 years, and that, I don't know if that pace will continue, but most of the growth is expected there. Africa's been running about 4 to 5% over the last 15 years. Continued growth is expected there. Middle East has been running about 3% the last 15 years. Substantial growth is expected there. The United States has been clipping along at about 1.5%. Europe at about 1%. Japan roughly flat. So again, all of the opportunity seems to be in the developing world. So the punchline is this. For you as future participants and leaders in this industry, expectations are, and I'm drawing from three, I'm drawing from three sources. One is, and you may be aware of this, there are two terrific studies that are put out every spring. One is by ExxonMobil, and one is by BP. They're put out in March, April of each year. They talk about all sorts of things about energy around the world, supply and demand. And I'm also, of course, drawing some from the EIA. So the prediction is that new demand for energy will roughly double between now and 2040. Well, that's huge. And 95 to 98% of that will come from the 161 countries that make up the developing world. So when I said earlier, one, it's going to be an exciting next 20 years, and it's an international issue. When you think about carbon and climate and fuel sources and talent and technology and all these issues that we're facing in this industry, and think about where much of the focus will be over the next several years, just understand that that's an exciting opportunity for all of us. So again, most of that is represented in the developing world. So let me go to topic number 2, which is to bring back and look a little bit about some of the challenges we're facing in the US. And let me also now introduce a third variable into that new energy demand that would not have been in place 15, 20 years ago. Now it's a very powerful force in terms of how we think about energy. For anybody in here that goes to energy conferences, you see a graph like this every time. I mean, it's just one of those things to show. And what you can, I appreciate it's a little small. The x-axis is time going back to roughly 1950, and the y-axis shows load growth. And for those of you that may be a little less familiar with the industry, when we say load, we're talking about energy unit sales, kilowatt hours. And in the energy sector, we talk about load, and you can see that we've had positive load growth over the past 50 years, but it's declining. The growth curve is declining. So imagine this, from 1950, coming out of World War II, to 2007, it's 57 years. In this country, we only had 2 years where we didn't have positive, and sometimes very positive, year-over-year load growth in this country. 2 times out of the last 57. Then you get to the recession, 2008, we were down. Recession continues, 2009, we're down. We're climbing out of the recession, 2010, we're up. We're down in 11, we're down in 12, we're barely up in 13, we're barely up in 14, we're down in 15, we're down in 16, we're gonna be down in 17. So 2 out of 57, we were down. 7 out of the last 10, we're going to have negative load growth in this country. Now layer on top of that, when you talk about the power industry, it's one of the most capital-intensive industries in the world. It's largely, in many cases, regulated. It's a cost-of-service model. You recover your costs through energy sales. So even though your cost structure is about 60 to 70% fixed, power plants, poles, lines, substations, facilities, you recover that largely through energy sales. What you need in that industry with that set of issues is growth. And we've had growth, but now we don't. So when you talk about a challenge that this industry is facing going forward in the United States, the third variable that I'm referring to is, we call it here, once it pops up, distributed energy resources. It's really, and there's many categories of distributed energy resources. The big one that's really driving this today is energy efficiency. We are able to manage our energy so very differently, whether it's lighting, whether it's efficient appliances, smart homes, conservation, energy management, a whole range of things that we can do to be more efficient in how we manage energy. And that is one of the things, not the only thing, but one of the things that's suddenly causing us to see this negative growth. So when you think about new load now, you think about population growth, economic growth, and what is my economy and my region going to be heavily impacted by distributed energy resources. Other examples, by the way, of distributed energy resources would be self-generation, storage or batteries, demand response, electric vehicles, microgrids, home area networks, Nest solutions, all sorts of things like that would be an example of a distributed energy resource that allows us to manage energy differently than we have in the past. Okay, so we talk about a big challenge for this industry. When you're a public company, a Duke Energy, you want to attract investors, you want to show earnings growth, you want to do all these sorts of things, and it's hard to do that today in the face of declining unit sales. And we'll talk about that as we go. Topic number 3, the move toward green. And again, I know that generally that should surprise nobody. I don't know if you're familiar with the RE100, the Renewable Energy 100 campaign. You're probably more familiar with it than I am, but it's sponsored by the Climate Group. It was launched in around 2011, maybe 2012, and the effort was to get large multinational well-recognized brands to commit to being 100% supplied by renewable energy at some period of time. And what's interesting about it is, you can see the list of companies here. I've highlighted a couple to let you know these are not chump change sorts of companies. These are the kinds of companies that everybody recognizes. These are also the kinds of companies that touch billions of people on this planet. And many of those customers and clients are aligned socially and aligned environmentally with these companies. So when you see companies committing to being 100% renewable, you can assume there's going to be a trickle-down effect to the consumer base, and that creates a groundswell of support for moving toward green energy. If you go to re100.org, and again, you probably know as much about this as I do, that's the website that talks about the companies. There's actually 113. Their campaign was to get 100. They've already exceeded that. They put together an annual report each year. That's why they call it annual report. And if you go to that, they actually show all the companies, and they show how they're trending today against that 100% commitment. And I won't get this exactly right, but I'm going to guess out of those 113, probably a third are already at 100%. And then another third is between 80 and 100, and the other third has got a lot of work to do. But the important part is there's a major momentum shift and move towards green. That's the demand side. Let's talk about the supply side. So if you go from 2000 to 2016, and I'm talking about the United States, and you look about the generation capacity in the United States, in 2000, we had about 800 gigawatts of power plant in the United States. That's 800,000 megawatts. About 45% of that was coal, about 30% of that was natural gas, and the remaining 25% was split roughly equally between renewables and nuclear. So the energy component would have been different, but that was the capacity component. Now you fast forward to 2016, we have over 1,100 gigawatts, so we've had about a 40% increase in just capacity in the last 16 years. And now about 45% of that is gas, about 30% of that is coal, so that's shifted, about 8 or 9% of that is nuclear, and about 16 or 70% of that is renewables. So overall, everything's grown, and of course, the slice of the pie represented by renewables has grown. In fact, it was 100 megawatts, 100,000 megawatts, 100 gigawatts in 2000. It's doubled that today, so it's about 200 gigawatts today, so that's meaningful. Back in 2000, it was about 90% hydro, and about 10% other. Today, it's about 40% gas, about 40% hydro, about 40% wind, and about 20% solar and other. So we've seen a big shift toward wind, we've seen a growing shift toward solar, and if you just look now at the last couple of years, so we've talked 16, let's just talk the last 2 or 3. For the most part, a third of all new capacity that's going in place is gas, because it's the most economic today. At $3 gas prices and $700 a kilowatt to install a gas plant, it's the most economic. About a third of it is wind, and about a third of it is solar. You have some other examples, and you may be, for example, we have a little nuclear going in place in Georgia and South Carolina, and we've got a few challenges there, and you've got some methane gas, and you've got some biomass. So you have other stuff, but it's about a third gas, about a third wind, and about a third solar. Those represent the only really go-to market technologies today and looking forward for the next many years. Now, something could happen that could change that, but those are the 3 technologies that we're looking at for the most part. The one that's growing out of all that, of course, is solar. So let's talk about some stats around solar. Solar, you may be familiar with the DOE Sunshot Initiative, right? The Sunshot Initiative was launched in either 11 or 12. And the rough price, and of course the goals of the Sunshot Initiative were to put policies in place and incentives in place and demand interest in place to bring down rapidly solar energy costs so it would be competitive with other technologies. In 2011, when it was established, if you talked about utility scale, commercial, and residential solar, and I'm giving you round numbers so I can remember them, roughly the costs of solar energy in 2011 for those 3 were 30 cents a kilowatt hour, 40 cents a kilowatt hour, and 50 cents a kilowatt hour. The goal for 2020 was we want to bring each one of those down to 6 cents, 8 cents, and 10 cents. Well, we've already put a check mark on the utility scale. It's already at 6 cents. even though it was a 2020 goal. And this isn't in Phoenix, by the way, this is in Kansas City, Missouri. That's their benchmark place. That's where we have 6 cents utility scale, industrial scale solar. We do not yet have 8 cent and 10 cent for commercial and residential, but they're close. We're gonna achieve those goals by 2020. 2030 goal is 3 cents, 4 cents, 5 cents. So a 90% reduction from what we had just in 2011. So we're seeing dramatic reductions in costs related to solar, which is one of the reasons it is the most exciting opportunity today for green power. So a lot of activity on the green side, and again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with many of these stats, but that's where the excitement is. So let's move to technology a little bit. I know you have a panel today on technology that's going to talk, one on technology and a separate one on customer engagement, which I look forward to hearing. But I like to offer this up on the technology side. If you talk about the domestic energy industry, there are 40 IOUs, investor-owned utilities, in the United States for power. And I like to talk market cap because it gives you a sense of market muscle and the ability to do things. The market cap of all 40 of those companies is about $640 billion. The top 10, the market cap's about 400, the top 20, it's about 500, and the top 40, it's about $640 billion. And again, recognizable names. The top 10 are NextEra. You have somebody on the panel here from NextEra would be number 1. Duke Energy would be number 2 in Charlotte. Southern Company in Atlanta would be number 3. Dominion in Virginia would be number 4. Exelon in Chicago would be number 5. AEP in Columbus is number 6. PG&E in San Francisco is number 7. Con Ed in New York is number 8. Southern Cal is number 9 in Los Angeles, and Excel in Minneapolis is number 10. Big names. You've surely heard of some of those, if not all of those. Big names, and combined is $600 and some billion. What I offer as an interesting point is when you talk about other companies that have a very real and sincere interest in this space, they're companies you obviously know, but what I want to emphasize is these guys are enormous. I mean, Google is about $750 billion. You saw the news last year on Apple with all the new iPhone. It's approaching $1 trillion. I want to say it's $900 billion today. So they trump by 50% in some cases the entire IOU community in the United States of energy companies. And you kind of say, well, that's so what? The so what is, and they have a sincere interest in this space. They want to apply technologies. They want to engage with your customers, our customers. They want to change the landscape of energy management. In all cases, everyone's doing something a little different, but in all cases, these big companies have an interest in this space. So again, I look forward to the technology panel, but I can't overemphasize, if you talk about some things that we're seeing today in the space that maybe we didn't see 20 years ago, we always saw a lot of change. But one of the biggest areas of change is this introduction of big companies, big names, big capabilities with technology solutions. They're going to change our business. Let me just give you 2 examples. You're familiar with the Nest thermostat, I'm sure. Did you know Nest was owned by Google, right? Google acquired Nest in 2011, 2012. They paid 12 times, not EBITDA, which for you finance folks, you usually think a multiple of EBITDA. They paid 12 times revenue. Well, I've never heard of that. I'd sell our firm in a New York minute at half that. Somebody offered me 6 times revenue, and you've got ScottMadden in your back pocket. 12 times revenue, so that suggests a sincere interest in the space, right? Of course, they're an $800 billion company, so I appreciate they have the market heft or muscle to do that. But they've demonstrated they have a real interest in this space. I listened into a Nest webinar a couple of weeks ago, and they threw out a few stats which I was not aware of, one of which was 40% of the homes in the United States have smart thermostats. Not all Nest, but smart thermostats. One, I thought that was a little higher than I might have imagined. And they said out of those 40%, 25% of the 40, so 10% in total, actively engage with their Nest thermostat. And they said that those that do actively engage are able to easily bring down their cooling and heating usage, i.e. bill, between 10 and 20%. Easily, just through active engagement and really an understanding and how to manage their energy differently. And I'm talking about at the residential level. The commercial and the industrial have become very sophisticated over time. It's the residential, the 250 million households out there that somebody like Nest is interested in, and somebody like our utility friends are probably not interested in having them take that relationship in some cases. Now, Nest actually partners with utilities, but let's not misunderstand what the long game might be for a technology company like Google that in this case has Nest. The other one is electric vehicles. Again, maybe nothing gets quite as much chatter as that today other than solar. When you talk about the opportunities, long-term growth, what utilities are focused on. In the US today, there were 260 million cars on the road. There are 600,000 electric vehicles. So it's a drop in the bucket. So we can talk with exciting possibilities with EVs, but they ain't happening yet. I mean, it represents way less than 1%. But you look at somebody like Volvo, who has said in 2019, I'm going to get out of internal combustion engines. You talk about the UK that's putting in a policy they're not going to allow any sale of gas or diesel engines in 2040 and may not allow any of them on the road in 2050. Netherlands is doing the same. Norway is doing the same. When you, again, groundswell, the Renewable Energy 100, when you start to see this sort of momentum gathering around topics like that, you know, the expectation is in 2030, 2040, the landscape's going to look very different. Estimates are by 2040, 54% of the new sale cars in the world will be electric vehicles. Today, it's less than 1%. So I mean, that's going to require an enormous shift in infrastructure and customer behaviors, all sorts of things. But it does present all these challenges I'm talking about for the energy sector. That ain't a challenge. That's an opportunity. That's an exciting opportunity. That's a lot of load, potentially, if you have that kind of EV activity taking place in the world and the United States. The reason I put that up there, by the way, I talked about the technology companies earlier. It was rumored for a long time that Apple was actively engaged in an EV program. They had the Titan project, which you may be familiar with, that they thought was all about trying to get into an EV program by 2020. It has since either transitioned to or never was EV, but is now determined to be more of an autonomous vehicle software platform. But nonetheless, there's a lot of interest and activity from technology companies on providing support and opportunity on technologies like this. Last topic, and then I'll wrap this up, and I'll ask Zach to come up and take the lead. I talk about bigger is better. This really goes back to that first comment where I said we're seeing negative load, we're a highly capital-intensive industry, we're a cost-of-service model, we recover our costs through energy sales, you need growth. And in fact, quietly, this industry has grown. I mean, it's concentrated. Just in 1995, we had almost 100 IOUs, investor-owned utilities, and today we have 40. It was rumored many years ago that we would be down to 5 utilities by, I can't remember the time frame, 2010 or something like that, because they thought that the move towards consolidation would be rapid. And the only reason it hasn't happened is because you have so many regulatory impediments today. You're still protected by your state regulatory authorities, so somebody in Philadelphia or Pennsylvania isn't real excited about a Chicago company buying you, or somebody in Des Moines, Iowa isn't real excited about an Atlanta company buying you. So those impediments have restrained or restricted some of the consolidation we would have otherwise seen. But to some folks' surprise, we've in fact seen a lot of consolidation. And what you want is big balance sheets. You want to be able to ride these waves of up and down and uncertainty and risk with big balance sheets that allows you to grow earnings in ways you otherwise might not. So again, these are examples of the kinds of consolidation we've seen. And gas is the same. About a 60% reduction just in 20 years. That's a lot. So the so what is this? This is my last slide. So the question is, okay, what do leaders, future leaders in this industry, consultants perhaps, whichever side you might be on, what do you do in response to these and many other challenges? Somebody else could come up here and talk and they'd list 4 very different things than I did. And what I would suggest is Dr. Vermeer was nice enough to invite me to one of his classes a couple of years ago. And the topic that day was strategic planning using scenario planning. And I would submit to you the opportunity and the task in front of us is not to solve the riddle, because there's no solution, obvious solution to all these issues, but it's to engage in a thoughtful process at your company around scenario planning. I mean, really thinking about different scenarios of the future and what, in this case, your company might do to respond to those. And so, historically, when you talk about the utility sector, when they did scenario planning, they would really look around 2 dimensions, pretty straightforward. One would be around carbon. Are we going to have carbon markets? Are we going to have aggressive carbon reduction campaigns? And that axis would be yes, no. And another axis would really just be the economy. Are we going to see a robust growth, or are we going to see sluggishness? Kind of yes, no. And then suddenly you have a 2x2 matrix, and you've got 4 scenarios that you can begin to plan around. Well, it's not quite that simple anymore. You have a lot of other dimensions you want to add to it. Are we going to see a proliferation of distributed energy resources? Are we going to see a supportive or a difficult regulatory environment? And suddenly it's geometric, right? You go from 2 to 4 to 8 to 16, and you can very quickly overcomplicate matters. But the important thing is, it's the process of thinking through scenarios, engaging your leadership and talent around what might we do if we see that this scenario is the one that's unfolding. What are the signposts? What are the trigger events? What are the things, what are the key junctures that when we see that, we need to make some big decisions? And if you do that annually, refresh that annually, engage your leadership, and engage your board on those issues so they're equally informed, it can be a powerful tool. Again, it doesn't always solve exactly what the path is, because that's, I wish it was that easy. It ain't. And the fact that it's not as good for the consulting industry, but it's a healthy process for thinking about fleshing out, challenging, engaging, and hopefully making ultimately good decisions. So with that, I covered a lot, and I covered it quickly. I think we're on time, so I guess, Zach, I'll invite you up, and I'll let you take the reins. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Brad, for taking the time to come back to Fuqua and share these insights. And to be exact, 30 years on the nose of insights. So I think that's
ouch.
Really
Let's be honest, ouch.
But let's kick things off by learning more about how these trends you mentioned relate to your work and your leadership. So as the head of ScottMadden, you collaborate with energy organizations, executive teams, and boards, both crafting and implementing strategies. What are some of the most burning questions your clients are seeking to solve today?
Good question. Actually, I would say, it goes back, and I don't want to repeat myself throughout this, but I really think one of the burning issues is the challenge with load, right? And I focused on investor-owned utilities. Let me offer up a couple of other segments of the energy sector, but for the investor-owns, which make up probably about 60 to 65% of the entire energy space, it really is. That negative load is creating problems. So when I think about ScottMadden projects, and of course I won't mention companies, they're approaching that challenge in a couple of different ways. I can think of a couple of engagements where we're actively engaged in helping them go through, dramatic O&M operating expense cost reductions. Now, you would logically say, well, that may be helpful for 2019, but what's that going to do for 2030? Well, right now, they're focused on 2019. So that's one area where they're really trying to manage costs and trying to manage earnings growth through costs. There are other cases. I mentioned the M&A. I can promise you that every big company that I mentioned in those top 10 are actively and constantly looking and screening possible acquisition targets. If you can find somebody that represents a good fit with a lot of operational synergies, diversification, back office synergies, et cetera, you can manage earnings growth that way. Others are looking at new products and services. It's interesting, back in the roughly 2000 time frame, this industry was going through a process of deregulation. It wasn't nearly as dramatic as we thought it might be at the time, but at the time, there was a lot of concern from the utilities that they were going to lose, through retail choice, the relationship with their customers. So they thought, we're going to lose revenue, we've got to identify a lot of new services. They embarked on this campaign called ESCOs, Energy Service Companies. Suddenly that's back. Everybody's looking at new services to represent new growth. So those are all happening on the investor-owned side. I'll real quickly touch, there are other segments. There's independent power producers, there's cooperatives, there's public power, the TVAs and the Bonnevils and the city municipalities, and all that represents close to 40%. So it's a big segment too. And they're not worried about earnings growth because they're not public. I'd say for the most part, and not every one of them, they're just seeking survival. They don't have the access to capital that the IOUs do. They don't have the ability to invest in smart grid and some of the things that the IOUs are, and they don't want to get put out of the game. Suddenly if across the, you're a co-op and across the street's Duke Energy, and Duke Energy is enabling all this technology and capabilities for their customer, and you're across the street and you have none of that because they're unable to invest in it, it's creating some real challenges for them. So it's survival's a little overly dramatic. I don't want to overplay it, but they're really just trying to make sure they remain relevant.
Sure. And so that dynamic of declining load growth, but you also mentioned the groundswell afoot with electric vehicles will be a larger demand on the grid. And you spoke about just in general the technology advancements and the challenges in responding to these changes. For example, many experts are saying that what happened to solar prices over the past 10 years will now happen to solar. What, in your opinion, will the electric grid look like in 10 years, in 20 years?
The solar, were you referring to storage? You said the solar...
What happened to solar prices in the past 5 to 10 years? The decline in that is forecasted to happen for storage.
Oh, for storage.
And that, obviously will help encourage electric vehicles, larger grid demand, but in the face of a larger declining demand.
Yeah, that question comes up a lot. Of course, one of the supposed game changers that everybody talks about is the proliferation of storage. And storage has a couple of flavors. There's seasonal storage, which might be, pumped hydro and things like that. Much of the attention goes to battery storage, lithium-ion sorts of things, and that's where people are looking for a price curve reduction. I'm not an analyst on the topic of lithium-ion, but I can tell you the costs are already coming down dramatically. I look at parallels. So if you look at, I talked about the Sunshine Initiative, but if you look at solar, you had policy support, right, with RPSs and investment tax credits and sorts of things. You had a growing demand with the Renewable Energy 100. You have a passion and a customer base that maybe didn't exist years ago. And I see the same on storage or batteries. So we talked about the UK is talking about major policies putting in place, Netherlands, Norway, China, others. Well, that's going to create policy support. We talk about demand that already exists, that's growing. You have a gigafactory that Tesla has put in place out in Nevada that's pushing these sorts of batteries. I don't know how much it's gone down to date, but when I just look at parallels, my strong suspicion is we're going to see dramatic cost reductions. I saw a quote, and I'll get this wrong, but it was something like, in 2020, storage, and again, they're primarily talking batteries, will be economic, I think it was. And then in 2025, it will be material or meaningful, and in 2030, it will be pervasive, or something like that. And I don't know if that's the time frame, but my intuition more than anything else suggests that next 15 years, storage, particularly battery that I think you're alluding to with solar, will be very real, a very real part of our grid.
Absolutely, and I think foreshadowing a little bit the rest of today, combined with the demand response opportunities that you mentioned, and I know there's a blockchain panel later today that'll be really exciting, so that dynamic...
Don't ask me about blockchain.
I'm just trying to get people interested in the rest of the day.
Oh, you bet,
so.
no, absolutely. You bet.
Also foreshadowing the rest of today, you mentioned some of the biggest changes the energy industry is experiencing, one of which is the way utilities interact with customers. How have these changes in regulation and technology changed the way power and utility companies approach customer relationship management? How have they started to act more like Apple, like Google?
I use the Nest example, and I'll use my wife. It's great when you have one data point and you can kind of extrapolate any way you want off that. So I'll use my one data point, which is my wife. We have 2 properties. Both of them have Nest solutions, Nest platforms. 5 years ago, my wife only would be frustrated month to month because the bill would go up or down. And then today she's one, I don't know if I'd consider her highly engaged, but I'm going to say she's that 25% of the 40%. I mean, she acts. We can see today on our thermostat that based on your usage today and historical patterns and temperature predictions, you're going to have a $12 day, or you're going to have a $9 day or a $14 day. When she sees I don't know what her X is, but when she sees X or more, she's dialing things back. And I'm telling you, 3 years ago, that would have never, ever, she didn't have visibility. She didn't have any notion of what that is. So back to customer engagement, the smart grid, they always talk about, it has a lot of elements, but two of the elements is it allows two-way power flow and it allows two-way communication. So now she's able to receive signals, from our utility in terms of what our power bill is going to be this day, where, again, we could not have seen that years ago, and she acts on it. And so, again, I appreciate it's just 10% in total, but in 5 years it's going to be 25% in total, in 20 years it's going to be 75% in total, and it's going to be impactful.
Absolutely, and one of the most interesting things I've learned in classes at Fuqua is the movement from utilities treating their customers from ratepayers to customers.
Correct.
On the utility side, but then also on the demand side, Dan Ariely's here at Duke, very interesting in behavioral economics and measuring and then motivating and then managing. And so I think it's both sides of the equation, as you mentioned.
Real quickly, another important element of that, of course, is on the regulatory side, you have to have a pricing construct that allows customers to react. So if you just have flat pricing and flat rates, you really aren't going to react because it is, you can dial back usage, but you really can't shift usage. But if you have time of use rates or other platforms that allow you to really understand this is when it's cheaper and this is when I should run these appliances, which exist in a few locations, it's a growing piece of the pie.
It's definitely growing.
Again, it allows the customer to engage much more effectively.
Yeah. So for my last two questions, before we turn it over to the audience's questions, we'd love for you to now just take a look back on the evolutions of the energy sector. You've been with ScottMadden.
Because I've been around 30 years.
and I'd love, in 30 years, if I can come back to Fuqua as CEO of a top energy consultancy, it would be a win. So.
Good recovery.
So for you to take a look back at the evolving energy sector, since 1993, what is the biggest surprise you've seen in the energy sector in your decades of experience?
I have a few colleagues in the room, but I was talking to Chris Vlahopoulos, who I think is on your panel next, and we were talking a little bit about that, and I would say, and this may disappoint you, that my biggest surprise is there really hasn't been a big surprise. And this is what I mean by that. When I look back at my 25 years, there have been a lot of times where we thought, boy, the next 3 years are going to look, it'll never look the same. We had deregulation, and we were going to be 5 energy companies in the United States, and we had Enron, and we had new markets, and we had all sorts of things. We had the death spiral, and just all sorts of things that have always been out there. And I would say that today is no different. It is looking very different and very exciting. There's an EEI conference going on right now. So EEI is the Edison Electric Institute, and twice a year they bring all their CEOs and CFOs and all the analysts together, and they basically get to all the large companies and share their story. And so there's a lot of articles being written yesterday and today about what the various utilities were having to say over the last couple of days. And like I've witnessed in the past, they're all saying, a little bit to your question, Zach, this is the most exciting time our industry has ever had. The next 10 years will look so very different than the past. And I think that's probably true, but it's play it again, Sam. I've heard that a lot. What I do think is when people say that the utility sector will not be able to manage the change or handle the pace of change with new technologies and others, again, I don't believe that. I think they've managed change effectively. There will be winners and losers. I said that early on. There will always be, and there should be, if somebody can't keep up with some of the pace of change with some of these technology companies. But I think that this is an exciting time, but I think we've had a lot of exciting times, and I think the industry will manage it well.
That's great to hear, because even these 2 years in business school, for me, I feel like I've had FOMO with all the exciting things happening in the energy industry, the advent of fracking, the soaring of renewables. But I think you're right. There is always something exciting happening, and there will continue to be.
Right.
So, for my last question, you may remember sitting in these chairs when you attended Fuqua. For students excited to build a career in energy, what is the one thing you wish you had known when you were an MBA student, or what is the one piece of advice that you have?
I talk to recruits a lot, so my go-to answer is maybe a little bit less about what's unique about the energy industry, although, as I said at the beginning, I really think it's one of the most exciting industries that we'll have in this world for the next 20 years, your careers. So I think that's exciting. My advice, though, I'll offer kind of 3 pieces. It's only fresh in my mind because I do this with recruits. One is, I think, maybe one of the most powerful tools you'll take from this, your experience at Fuqua or Nicholas or wherever you may be, is your network. And if there's one thing that I really did a poor job of, it's maintaining, nurturing, leveraging the network that I assembled and built while I was at school. And I see colleagues of mine that have done a good job of that, and how 30 years later, they're still actively tapping in and being supportive and working with their network. So that's item number one. I would really encourage you to recognize that capability and strength you're taking out of here. Number two, and I advise our consultants of this all the time, is you got to stay in the game. It's easy to come out of here and be excited for the first year, but you're talking about a 30-year career, and it's easy to find yourself kind of in a bit of a lull, complacency for 5 or 10 years, and suddenly you're not in the game anymore. You're not sharp, you're not relevant, you're not on top of it. And when I work at companies, I always stand, because we, as a firm, like any other consulting firm, we're not always dealing with the EVPs and CEOs. We're dealing with the director levels and VP levels, and where the work gets done. And I sometimes just sit back and go, why is it that those 5 people are in the executive suite and these other folks that are enormously talented, smart, engaged, sharp, why are, and roughly the same age in my example, why are they not up there? And I think one of the reasons is that those that made it to the top are those that always recognized, they stayed sharp, they stayed in the game, and they recognized their openings. When there was an opportunity to excel, you've been asked to come up and present to the leadership team on something, don't just prepare, over-prepare, wow them. Or you're on a special project team, run that project like it's your own. I mean, those sorts of things where you can really excel. So, and that's number two. And my third piece of advice for a career would be positive, be upbeat, be somebody that people want to be around because you have an optimistic and positive outlook. It is really easy to be the naysayer, the criticizer, the one that always finds fault with everybody. And I still think the ones that will make it for the long haul are the ones that have a very positive outlook on life, on work, on your colleagues. So that would be my 3 pieces of
that's great advice.
30-year tenured advice.
That's great advice, especially for my second-year classmates as we get ready to jump out into the real world again. So
that's right.
We're now going to turn to some of the questions for the audience. They've submitted questions here. And so the first one is, what are utilities doing to respond to cybersecurity threats? And does distributed generation make the grid more or less robust to these kind of attacks? Well,
the cybersecurity is, I assume it's a huge deal in any industry when you see all the attacks that have taken place, and I think my information's been exposed in 2 or 3 different environments. For the utility sector, it is job one. I mean, the cybersecurity and NERC standards and all the things that the DOE and the government are putting on, layering in terms of requirements on the utility sector to manage cyber issues is unrelenting. So it's many of the companies would say it's too much, it's overburdensome, it's administrative, but it's unrelenting, and they're ratcheting them up all the time. So that's huge. To the notion of, now that we're moving to more of a transform grid and distributed generation and all those sorts of things, of course, that's just additional areas of exposure and additional challenges. You talk about blockchain, which I know is on your agenda later on. I mean, those are sorts of solutions that people are looking at to, in part, address some of the risks and vulnerabilities associated with cyber attacks and others. So it is job number one. Fortunately, I don't spend any of my time and attention there. We have a segment of ScottMadden that does, and it's one that they couldn't be busier because everybody's trying to do things to manage it.
That's great to hear, absolutely. I've read recently about the expedited process, the regulatory process for electric vehicle testing and getting them on the road, and there are some concerns that is this process too fast? And I think it's more about what the vehicles will do in certain situations because cybersecurity seems to be pretty buttoned up, and they're putting so much effort into that. We were actually just last week, the General Motors electric vehicle people were in, and they hired the hackers who were able to hack into their system.
Right, so. Of course, yeah.
And the next question is, you began your talk with the big picture for economic and population growth worldwide, and how this will drive energy demand, given that nearly all of the growth will be in the developing world. What are some of the top lessons you think they could take away from the developed countries? either things that they should mimic or that they should avoid?
Well, I mean, a couple things. I'm not sure 10 minutes. I'm not sure when I talked about the energy efficiency piece, when I said earlier that we expect energy demand to double, new energy demand, I don't know if I mentioned or not, but they said the net because of all this energy efficiency activity that's taking place, the net will actually be about 25%. So although the developing world is going to account for 100%, we're going to see, reductions in other parts of the world, and of course, the plan is that will be given or transported over to the developed. It's a little bit about the Paris Agreement. I mean, the Paris Agreement, and again, I hesitate to bring up some of these. You probably know some of the issues better than I do, but it's, it was all about recognizing that the developed world has a responsibility to help fund and support carbon management for the developing world in the coming years, and I think energy efficiency is a wonderful example of that. When we talk about, there's multiple ways of doing it. You have building codes, you have smart appliances, you have better lighting, you have better motors and fans and plant efficiency, and again, the list goes on and on. So transferring those sorts of capabilities, technologies, understandings to the developing world, which is happening anyway, is the best way. And what will happen, I'm quite certain, in terms of trying to manage this as a global opportunity, as a global challenge.
Absolutely, and I sometimes think that regardless of what happens with Paris and the United States' involvement in Paris, the train has already left the station in many ways, not only with developing countries, but California acting on its own accord independently.
Correct.
So
that's right.
So the next question is, do you see changes to behind-the-meter energy management and storage leading to new revenue opportunities for the average person? Or will energy revenue primarily remain with the energy companies?
Well, that's the death spiral, right? I mean, the death spiral, if you aren't familiar with that term, is what, the fear is that because you will have behind-the-meter generation and storage, that, the growing number of the customer base, industrial, commercial, residential, will be able to, to manage those, their own energy, not 100% of the time, but a large portion of the time. And then again, you have these utilities with high fixed costs that are trying to recover their costs through energy sales. They don't have the energy sales, and that's the death spiral.
Absolutely.
So it goes back a little bit to my earlier example that these things are going to catch the utilities by surprise, and they're not going to be they're going to not be playing in the game. And I use my few examples. We've heard that in the past, and that hasn't happened. I think it'll be all the above. I have no doubts that the customer base will be able to self-generate, manage their energy very differently in 10 years than they do today. And they will not be as fully reliant on the utility as they are today. You will never convince me, and I may be wrong, that utility won't still be an important part of the overall equation in 10 years and 20 years, whether it's wires only, some generation, supporting the distributed generation and storage. So I think they'll always have a role. Will they shrink, and will we see further consolidation because of that? Possibly. But I won't be convinced that they won't still have a role.
Absolutely, and that question actually, and your response is a great plug for several of the panels for the rest of the day, so stay tuned.
Good, yeah, good.
What part of the industry are you watching that you don't think gets enough attention? Yeah,
well, today, the industry shifted. So a few years ago, many years ago, all the big dollars, all the big assets, all the big excitement was on the supply side. So, it used to be about all the generation technologies and all the trading and marketing associated with that, and the wholesale markets throughout the country, and, the Enron story. So in the 90s and early 2000s, nobody really cared about transmission. Nobody cared about distribution. That was an afterthought. Well, it's interesting. Today, generation is getting much less attention and expenditure. Of course, we're talking about the shift to renewables. Not to say it's not getting it, but it's all about the grid, right? Where the opportunities are with the grid and what we're doing with the grid. So that's where it is today. With respect to where do I think it should be that maybe is not getting the attention, I think markets, if you look around the United States, you have organized markets in certain pockets, and you don't have organized markets in other pockets, and all the organized markets, MISO versus PJM versus ERCOT versus CAISO, are all structured a little differently. You don't have anything in the Southeast. So I think that a lot of the change that we're going to see is going to be in part around more consistent, organized markets and how the utilities and folks interact with that. Because now you can bundle, in some cases, distributed generation, and that looks like a wholesale generation, and it plays in the market. In other cases, you cannot. So there's a lot of maturing that needs to be done around markets. And I would say that may be an area that's not getting the attention that it likely will in the coming, once the grid becomes a little bit more mature, I think the markets will necessarily have to follow. Absolutely, and I think in the next 5 years, there's a ton of work to be done on the regulatory side, and right now with the uncertainty on the regulatory end, we'll see if they are up to the task. Yeah, regulatory, that's actually a really good point. It's probably worth mentioning. If you look at New York as the really good example, New York's going through a pretty ambitious transformation with the grid, what they call reforming the energy vision, the REV process. And they have all sorts of stakeholders that are involved. You've got the technology companies that I shared, and you have the customer base, and you have the utilities, and you have the regulators. And as it's been described to me, we have folks that are actively involved, I'm not, but as it's been described to me, the one that is just unable to keep pace, not intellectually, but just in terms of their process, is the regulator side. So I think your point is a better response than mine. That one needs a lot of attention. If we want to keep pace with all the changes we're likely to see, the regulatory body is the one that needs to, to really sharpen its efforts to keep pace. Absolutely. And the last question here is, can you outline the characteristics of the investor-owned utilities that make them dependent upon growth and load versus steady-state profitability? Is this different from public-owned utilities? Do we need to consider different business models? Are there any examples of emerging business models among public or investor-owned utilities? So your last question is, might be the toughest. Just ask that last part of that question again. Sure. Are there any examples of emerging business models among the public or investor-owned utilities? And by examples, they mean new revenue models vis-a-vis those dependent on growth and load. Right. Well, I think on the investor-owned, you say, do you need growth, or are we satisfied with stable, consistent? And I would say, as an investor, would you be satisfied with stable, consistent earnings? I mean, I think that the answer is probably no. As an industry, so maybe so I guess the implication is, do you have to think about a different model that's perhaps not a public model that's looking for growth? So right now they are looking for growth. Their investors are demanding growth. Otherwise, they won't get capital that can compete with other areas. So that's a particular challenge. I think that's a big one. Again, when I talked about the nonprofit side, the munis and the public power and the co-ops, I think we have almost 1,000 cooperatives as an example. So I talked about the quiet consolidation that's taken place in the investor-owned. I am quite certain that you're going to have to see something similar on the co-op and muni side, a massive consolidation in order to manage the challenges that lie ahead. So they're going to try to mimic what's taking place on the investor side. The investor side is going to try to manage growth through new services, new products, mergers and acquisitions, and those sorts of activities. I think what was predicted many years ago, that we'll be down to 5 utilities at some point certain, is still a likelihood. We have a graph that we use a lot, but it looks at other capital-intensive industries, airlines and trucking and banking and all these different other capital-intensive industries over time. And if not for the regulatory impediments that I mentioned earlier, almost all of those have been reduced to a small handful, because you need to have that level of concentration in order to manage that capital intensity. We haven't seen it in the utility sector. I think we will, and so I would suggest that's the direction we're headed. Do you think, you mentioned in your presentation as well, the need for the large balance sheet to absorb these dynamics. Do you think that these smaller utilities that haven't consolidated yet or impeded from consolidating can band together and co-invest either in new technologies, acquisitions, or VC funds or infrastructure to sort of bypass that constraint? I think that's possible. I would say the level of sophistication, I don't want to be ugly, in some of those cases is a little less aware of those sorts of opportunities, but I think that survival will create a lot of behavioral changes. So sure. I think in some of those cases, what you're describing is very real. Back to the investor-owned, they are partnering. I mean, with the Google example and the Nest, I mean, I don't mean to suggest Nest is not partnering carefully with its utilities. So they recognize we've got to partner with these big players or we're going to get squeezed out of the game. Sure. And I think the same thing is happening in all sectors of the energy space. Well, I think we're nearly out of time, and so just on behalf of all of us at Fuqua and Duke and the Energy Conference, thank you so much for coming. Thank you all.